I want to first step back from carbon trading and look at mitigation. After all, carbon trading is a means to an end, and the end is mitigation, the reduction of emissions. One simple point I want to make is that however we do it, it's going to cost developing countries a lot to reduce emissions. We often think that mitigation will be cheap for developing countries, right? We think, well, look, we've already built our coal-fired power plants. What are we going to do with them? You know, we either have to retrofit them or we have to decommission them and build something else, whereas developing countries are yet to build a lot of their modern infrastructure, so they can leapfrog and go straight to solar or nuclear. Plus, they have all these cheap forest emissions that they can avoid. Well, those are certainly valid arguments, but it's only part of the story. The other part is that on average, developing countries use more energy and emit more emissions per unit of output than developed countries. Now, that might sound paradoxical given what I've just said about all the energy poverty, right? But in fact, the household sector is not the big user of energy. Right? It's the industrial sector. And if we think about developing Asia, they've got rapidly growing industrial sectors, including to make a lot of stuff that we import. So in a sense, we've outsourced our emissions to the developing world. But anyhow, this fact that they produce more emissions, not in an absolute or per capita sense, but per unit of output, pushes up their mitigation costs. And in fact, if you look at the modelling that the Australian Treasury did last year, and we worked closely with the Australian Treasury in the Ghana review, showed it will cost developing countries a lot more to mitigate than developed countries. Right? This is in 2020, percentage of GDP, and you can see it's a very small number for developed countries, much smaller than for developing. Now, of course, different models will give you different results, but the point is here simply that ratio. Now, this is without carbon trading. Okay? This is a world where everyone just puts in a carbon price. Domestically, we don't have trading. Now we introduce trading, so that's the red line, and you can see carbon trading certainly helps. Right now, we have developed countries buying emissions from developing countries, buying permits from developing countries, so developed countries have to spend more, developing countries get that revenue, that pushes down their costs. But you can see it's basically equalised the costs. Costs are now shared equally between developed and developing worlds. But that itself, might look, okay, reasonable, but on reflection, it's not really a very fair way of approaching a global issue. When we think that developing countries are much poorer than developed countries, and when we think that it's developed countries that have caused this problem in the first place. And that's why I want to suggest that we have to go beyond carbon trading. I want to suggest there are two other things that developed countries need to do apart from promoting carbon trading. So one is a push on technology. What we need is the developed countries to develop those new technologies which will push down the price of modern, low-carbon forms of energy, to reduce the price of solar, wind, nuclear, to get carbon capture and storage to work, and to demonstrate that these can work. We need the private sector to do this, and they will start to do it once there is a price on carbon, but we also need the governments to put up public funding. That's critical for any R&D push. And unfortunately, energy R&D spending has stagnated since the 70s. This is just to illustrate from the United States, but it's a similar story across the developed world. We boosted energy R&D when we had the oil crisis in the late 70s, or in the 70s. But once oil prices fell, that R&D expenditure fell away with it. And we're yet to see any, this only goes to 2005, and I think there's been a slight resurgence since, but we need to really boost our energy R&D spending. And then second, we need to also transfer these technologies, existing and new, to developing countries, not only through the markets, but also through governments. Getting the hundreds of millions who still live in energy poverty out of that poverty in a clean, low emissions way should be a shared global responsibility, and not simply the responsibility of the national governments of the developing world. The markets can play a role in this, but it can't be left solely to the markets for the reasons I've given before. So the Ghana review recommended that in addition to carbon trading, the rich governments of the world enter into a commitment, which we call the International Low Emissions Technology Commitment, to provide $100 billion a year, half of which would be spent on R&D at home and half on promoting mitigation in developing countries. And Australia's share of that total worked out to about $3 billion a year. So we were suggesting something almost as large as our current aid program, as part of a combined developed country initiative, a public funding push. It is ambitious. It certainly dwarfs current global spending in this area, but it's the sort of funding that will be needed. So to conclude, all countries, rich and poor alike, clearly have an interest in reducing emissions to avoid the worst risks of climate change, which, as we all know, will hit the poor the hardest. But for poor countries, tackling climate change cannot, and in any case will not be at the expense of the priority they'll continue to give to eliminating energy poverty. So the emissions of poor countries will continue to rise for some time. For these countries, we need to bend the curve so that emissions rise, but more slowly than they have been. And that's such a big job that it will take a number of tools. There's no single tool that will meet that challenge on its own. Carbon trading is certainly one of the tools, but developed countries will also need to invest in new technologies and support developing countries with international public funding. What I want to suggest is that the elimination of energy poverty and the global diffusion of clean energy is too big a task to be left to carbon trading on its own and to the private sector, and in fact should also become a priority for our international aid. Thank you.